My philosophy has always been, why is it now just a problem, right? Why is skin cancer just on the rise now? Like, what is the transition or some of the things that have changed over the last 100 years for us to see this kind of uptake in it? All right, season two, episode three. We're going to talk about probably the most underrated nutrient that you can't eat and you can't drink, and that's that thing in that sky. We're going to talk about the sunlight today. A lot of people that follow me, you guys know that I talk about this all the time, and I'm always talking about the importance of sunlight and why we should be having it and getting sun exposure and all the health benefits that come downstream from it. And I think we've seen this just kind of transition where a lot of people have borderline feared the sun, right? And we think about the relationship between the sun and melanoma and skin cancer and kind of all the negative effects that, can possibly come from it. So what I really wanted to talk about today is kind of demystify some of those subjects and really talk about the basic. I kind of broke it up into three pillars today. Number one is we're going to talk about like what is sunlight, right? Like when we think about full spectrum light and the health benefits that come from it, but what is it, right? Second thing is like, what is it doing for us, right? I think a lot of us just think about the very typical, it gives us vitamin D, and that's really the thing that we get from it. But there's so much more that obviously comes downstream from that as well. And then the third and final one is really just kind of talking about the importance of making vitamin D, even though the thing that we do think about being the big part of the sunlight, and what are some of the negative health consequences of actually not having enough sun exposure, right? And I want to just like polish off a little bit with some of the sunscreen conversation. I think, probably some of the stuff I talk about, people think I'm anti sunscreen, and that's definitely not the case. I just think about, my philosophy has always been, if the sun has been here for however many years, millions or billions of years, I don't know, why is it now just a problem, right? Why is skin cancer just on the rise now? Like, what is the transition or some of the things that have changed over the last 100 years for us to see this kind of uptake in it? And it's interesting because I was just like writing down a lot of show notes and just kind of trying to get everything ready for today last night. And it's funny when you like look at some of the research, like how the areas that you think would be if the sun is directly a parallel for skin cancer, then why is it higher in some places that are colder that don't have a lot of sun, right? Or why is it higher in people that work inside all day, right? So that's where there's context, right? So there's basically kind of really what I want to focus on today is like, why should we be making sun exposure such a priority for optimal health, right? So the first thing I want to start with and kind of just going through the different wavelengths, right? So we think about like the sun is magnetic wavelengths, right? But those wavelengths come in different spectrums, right? The shorter the wavelength is, the more energy there is, right? So when we think about something like UVB, UVC, those type of things, those are going to be on the shorter side. And when we think about infrared being on the higher side, those are going to have some more of the healing properties, right? So just to kind of list some of these off for you guys, UVC being at the bottom, right? So this is anywhere from 100 to 280. And when you see NM, that's basically nanometers, which is 1 billionth of a meter. So this is kind of the range that's going from it, right? So UVC would be the bottom, mostly filtered by ozone. So this is not something that we're really getting a lot of exposure to. UVB being the big one. This is what a lot of us would think about with sunburns, or this is where a lot of energy comes from, and obviously in the middle of the day. So this is going to be something that's actually going to help trigger the vitamin D production. Third one, I'm sorry, is going to be UVA. This is going to be 315 to 400 nanometers. This is going to penetrate a little bit deeper, and this is going to stimulate the nitric oxide release. This is going to stimulate melanin production. And this is obviously when you think about getting tan and some of the other benefits that I'll talk about in a second, you're getting that in this actually UVA. Then we get into what's visible light, right? And when we think about visible light, it's in the word. This is the stuff that we can actually see, right? This is what's actually giving us light. And that's one thing that's actually kind of interesting is we think that all light is something that's visible, and that's not the case, right? So this 400 to 700 nanometer range, these are the visible lights that we're actually able to see. So this regulates circadian rhythm, vision, mood. And when you think about sleep and some of the stress stuff, a lot of what I'm going to talk about in a second, I'll give you kind of guys more detail. The visible light, even though we're not talking about the melanin production or the vitamin D production or some of the mitochondrial health stuff that you get from near infrared and far infrared light, the visible is really, you have to remember this, that the sun is our clock, right? Meaning that the human body doesn't necessarily have a clock, right? We use the light as our clock. And before we came out with watches and clocks, that's what we use, right? So I've always said that probably one of the most ideal ways of living and the most ideal way of eating is staying in tune with the light, right? And understanding that it is seasonal, right? So, an easy way to think about this, and I talk about this with nutrition a lot, is try to have all your food during daylight. And this is something that I personally struggle with a lot because I tend to get home late and I'll cook dinner late and I'm eating when the sun's down. And I think from an ideal health perspective, it's not going to be the best for the optimal health outcome, right? So, an easy hack for most people to think about when you think about just living, sleeping, and eating is try to stay in line with lights, right? Because the visible light is the thing that's going to basically kind of be able to regulate that for the human body, right? When I think about this regulation of light, you have to understand that the circadian rhythm is triggered by visible light, right? When we think about the mood benefits from the serotonin and the dopamine and some of the other things that are going to come from it, also triggered by visible light, right? Next one's blue light, right? And blue light is one of those things. So this is 450 to 950 nanometers, and this boosts alertness and the cortisol bump that we get in the morning. And I think blue light does have a lot of negative connotation towards it when most people talk about it, right? And I think that the thing to remember as far as context goes is it is a negative thing if we're getting a lot of it post sunset, right? Because blue light is something that the sun is going to give us when you think about this full spectrum of light, right? So where it becomes negative, and this is something we were actually just talking about in a team meeting, is if I'm getting a lot of blue light in during 10 p.m., midnight, the middle of the night, your body is thinking, when you think about this alertness or the cortisol bump that we get in the morning, your body's starting to think, oh, it's daylight, right? So that's where it becomes dangerous, right? But blue light in the beginning part of the day, or obviously in the middle of the day, is a great thing for us, right? Because when you look at cortisol, cortisol has this inverse relationship from melatonin, right? Meaning melatonin is going to be high at night, which is going to be the thing that's going to help us think about, okay, I need to go to bed. But melatonin should be the lowest in the morning, right? And the cortisol is going to be the exact opposite, meaning that cortisol is actually going to be highest in the morning and should be low at night. So even when you do blood work for cortisol testing, one thing that's interesting is they'll tell you like, okay, are we doing a morning test? Or are we doing an evening test? Because there's going to be a different range that's given based off the timing of the test. And that's because of the relationship of what happens between cortisol and melatonin being inverse. Where we start to run into all these sleep issues and downstream stress issues and all the things that kind of come from it from a health perspective is when those things start to become inverse, right? When think about a lot of people that are like, oh, I have energy at night, right? That could be cortisol being high, and that could be for a lot of different reasons, right? So that's one thing that we do get from blue light that is a benefit, but it also can be a negative thing if we're getting that at the wrong time. And then the last one, or the second to last one, I'm sorry, is going to be red light. So 620 to 950. This is going to be more mitochondrial health and tissue repair, right? And this kind of comes in, and I'll just finish up with this last one so I can talk about both of them. Infrared, 700 to 1400, right? So when you think about this being a long wavelength, right, this is going to be something that's going to help with blood flow, collagen, and reduce inflammation. And it's funny because when you think about red light and you think about infrared light, we actually saw a little bit of a kickoff as far as like, I don't want to say, I mean, it is artificial lighting, but when you think about like tanning beds, right? Tanning beds are going to be something that's going to be UVA because it's going to be something that's hopefully a little less harmful than UVB, but it's also going to help with the tanning aspect of it. Now, I'm not promoting tanning beds. This is not the point of this conversation, right? There was a time back in the day where I was using tanning beds back when I was in my Jersey Shore era, but it's definitely something that I don't suggest anybody using because you're not getting full spectrum light. But on the other side of artificial lighting, I do see a benefit to this red light and this infrared light. During the pandemic, it was interesting. I kind of went through this little biohacking stage where obviously if you give me too much time, my body does weird things and I spend money on weird things. And I bought the sauna and I bought the cold plunge and I bought the red, near infrared light panel at home, and definitely a very expensive product for what it is. I used it really consistently for probably about 2-ish years, maybe 3. And I would just wake up in the morning, I would do a little stretching or meditation in front of the red light and try to double down on that. Now, I will say, if I'm being transparent here, I definitely have fallen off on that. So the question is, from a light perspective or sunlight perspective, I'm sorry, where do we get the red light and the infrared light? And the answer is sunset and sunrise, right? First thing in the morning, and then the last thing at the end of the day, right? So this is why a lot of people, when they think about like, okay, working into sun exposure, like what are the things that I should be doing to help build myself up to be able to handle more sun exposure at times? And that comes from first thing understanding that the signal that you're going to get and the health things that you're going to get from a mitochondrial perspective, right? And these are the little machinery that are obviously pumping out energy for the body. So when you think about the longevity part of conversations and a lot of these people, what they're talking about in that space, they always come back to mitochondrial health, right? And you get that from that red and near infrared light. So this is why it's so important to prioritize light first thing in the morning, right? If anybody has ever followed Andrew Huberman, he talks about this all the time. And I think he's probably the guy that's really put it on the map and made it mainstream, which I really appreciate because I think like a lot of people for so long have been scared of it. But early in the morning, late at night, it's almost impossible. Like, and I would put my money on this, and I'm not like a full-on expert on this, that impossible for you to get a sunburn because the thing that you think about being damaging to the skin is going to come from those UVA and UVB lights, right? And that only is really going to be some, when you think about like the UV index, that's only going to be something that's going to be an issue in the middle part of the day, right? So in the beginning parts of the day, you get the healing parts of the full spectrum of light, right? You're getting more of those longer wavelengths in the morning and you're getting some of those longer wavelengths at night. So trying to prioritize first thing in the morning or last thing at the end of the day and being able to kind of watch that. And it's funny because people always say like, oh, should I be watching the sun and staring it in the eyes? And I'm like, no. But it's funny that because when people say like, look at the sun to get the benefits, like understand that you could probably get away with it in the early morning or late at night when you like stare at a beautiful sunset, look at a beautiful sunrise. Try doing that in the middle of the day. You're going to freaking burn your retinas out, right? So when you think about this, the early morning light, high in red and infrared, low in UV, boost mitochondrial function. It's going to help prime the skin for exposure later too, because it's also going to be one of those things. And this is like something I'll touch on a little bit later of like how to basically tan without sunscreen is something that I found interesting was not using sunglasses, right? And this is something I think sunglasses are such an aesthetic piece to fashion for us. But if you can learn how to leverage light and understand that your body will do its thing, and that happens through direct exposure from in the eyes and on the skin. So getting that stuff early in the morning is actually going to trigger that, right? Also, like I talked about, it's going to trigger the natural cortisol rise, which we talked about. It's going to help entrain the circadian rhythm. It's going to increase dopamine and serotonin. And this is really going to become one of those things that I'm going to talk about a lot with mood, right? And I think for me, I am someone that is addicted to the feeling of what sun gives me. And I've always said I've kind of been a lizard my entire life. And I think that just comes from my mom and dad being people that just love the sun. But there is scientific benefits to why, or like reasons to why it's doing that. And the reason why that's happening is becoming from a couple things. Number one is you're going to get the serotonin production. Number two, you're going to get the dopamine. So the serotonin is going to be what we would think about as like that feel good, right? Dopamine is going to be that like motivational reward that we all get. So getting these like actual neurological triggers to happen is going to make us feel a lot better. So now we move kind of the midday, right? So this is where we get the most UV. This is the most potential for sunburn. And one thing I do want to make sure that it's really understood is sun exposure being the big part of what I'm trying to convince people on and motivate people towards making a priority for their health. You need to understand the risk of sun burning, right? And there's a very different thing. And don't get me wrong, as much as I preach this stuff as much as possible, I do see a lot of negative things that come from someone that's never been in light, never goes outside, goes on vacation or goes on a weekend trip to the beach and then burns themselves. That is like the worst thing you can do, right? And I think that's where a lot of these changes have actually come from when you think about skin cancer and some people telling us that sun is related to the melanoma risk. And I think that comes with context, obviously, because if you were someone that was outside or moving or getting a lot of early or late sunlight and kind of those like those healthier wavelengths like we were just talking about, your body is more primed to be able to handle the midday stuff. But then also, it is a melanin production thing, right? And this is something when you think about someone that is really pale or really white, it's like, okay, am I more sensitive to the sunlight? And the answer is yes. But the darker your skin is just means the more melanin you have. But that doesn't mean that you get to get away with doing that as well. There needs to be a balance no matter what race or skin color you are to understand that that melanin production is something that is a practice, right? Like it is something that you need to be able to build up in a sense, the calluses to be able to handle longer periods of time, right? And that's what's interesting when you go to the beach and it's like, okay, why did I only burn on my shoulders? Or why did I only burn on my chest or my back? And the answer is like, well, why not my forearms or my hands? It's because they're out more than anything else, right? So the more exposure they get gradually, the more they can handle. And that why that melanin production is going to be such an important thing for us, and not just talk about the tanning, but also the benefit things in a second. So evening, night, like I said, it's going to prepare the body for sleep. So this is signaling to the body to start producing the melanin, right? So when you start to think about, I'm watching a sunset and I'm watching the light disappear, both on the visible end of it, but then also on the red light end of it, your body is naturally getting this production of melanin, which is going to be the thing that's going to start to trigger, okay, it's time for us to start getting ready for bed. Where most humans in the modern day area make a mistake is we start to think, okay, now it's time for my TV. Now it's time for my cell phone. Now it's time for just artificial light inside the house. And this is where so many of us are falling in this trap, including myself, where your body's really having a harder time falling asleep or maybe even staying asleep. And a lot of this is really in alignment with the light. So that is something I really want to make sure that is like understood, that like if you can really hack your house or your environment to be kind of conducive to really optimal sleep, it would be addressing the lighting issue, right? So I have those, I forget the company that I use, but they used to be called, I think, a Bond Charge or something like that. But they have like red light bulbs, and it's basically these near infrared and red light bulbs. And I put them in the bedroom, right? My wife, at first, I think was kind of like, what the hell are we doing? This looks like a photography room almost, in a sense. I would put them all over the house. I would have salt lamps and red lights everywhere if I could. It definitely is quite the mood and a vibe, but I don't think it's something that's conducive if like we're cooking dinner at 8 o'clock at night and it's dark outside and she's like, hey, can we turn some regular lights on? But those actually make a big difference. Second thing is I also think like those blue light blockers, if you guys have ever seen those orange tinted lenses, you need to make sure that you're getting them from a good, like RA Optics, I think is a good one. Bond Charge, the one that I got. Sure, Amazon has some, but you want to make sure that you're getting a good quality one that actually blocks blue light. And that comes from not a clear lens or a yellow lens. It needs to be that dark amber light. And I got those about 5 years ago, and I am not joking. It is like a significant difference of me wearing those, even watching TV or being on a phone or computer, versus not. It's like immediately within like 10, 15 minutes, I just start to feel like a little bit drowsy. So it just goes to show you that like there is a lot of power in light. And I think a lot of us just undermine it or underestimate the power of it too, and how it regulates everything. Number 5 one I had there is circadian biology, right? Like sunlight is the master regulator for the entire thing of what we're just talking about, right? So hormone release, both on the cortisol, melatonin, testosterone, growth hormone, body temperature, your sleep wake cycles, your digestion, your metabolism, and your immune activity. And digestion's a big one too, because that is something I think for people that maybe have any gut issues or issues digesting food. And I'll give you, this is actually kind of funny because I literally had not the best night of sleep last night, but I had a very, very high fat meal with dinner last night. I did some stuffed bell peppers, bell peppers, ground beef, cheese at the bottom, cheese on top, a little bit of sour cream and dollop on top. And like 4 o'clock, I just woke up. Man, I feel like I did not digest that well. And the problem is a couple things. Number 1, super, super high fat. Number 2, really, really late at night. I probably ate around 9:30. And those two things together, when you think about digestion, is like everything, a circadian clock, meaning every gene and cell in the human body is on this 24-hour cycle, right? And things, in a sense, kind of turn on and off depending on the use. So when you think about digestion, we think about this, a lot of us have heard this with stress, that when we're in this parasympathetic mode, we're in this rest or digest state, and we're in this sympathetic mode, we're more in this fight or flight response. When you're sympathetic, your body's not able to digest food as effectively and efficiently, right? But when we're in this parasympathetic state, and this is why the importance of reducing stress or sitting down while we eat, those type of things are so important, right? So you see this a lot, obviously, on how light can kind of like regulate all these things. So just remember, your body is not running on a clock. It's running on light. Light is the clock for the human body. So that's the first section. Second thing for me is like, okay, what does the sunlight do for us, right? And I'm going to kind of read off a bunch of these things that I was kind of writing down throughout the night last night. And I'm going to start with the first one, which I think is the most important one, because that's going to be the last section of today's conversation. But it's boost vitamin D production. I think most humans, if not all humans, think about sunlight is great for boosting vitamin D. And we just pigeonhole it into that category. Right? So when you think about it, UVB rays trigger the vitamin D synthesis in the skin, right? So this is going to help with bone health. This is going to help with immune function. This is going to help with mood regulation. This is going to help with muscle function and cardiovascular health. So it's going to help with a lot of different things, right? And this happens through these UVB light making contact with the skin and our body synthesizing this hormone, right? And it is something that is a hormone. A lot of us think about it as a vitamin. And if we can learn anything through the pandemic, there was all this stuff coming out with vitamin D, right? Well, I think I was even on that boat too, because I was like, okay, if this helps with preventing COVID or lessening the effects of it, if I do get it, we were supplementing with vitamin D too. Now, supplementing is something like I talked about in last week's episode. You have to remember it's a supplement to something, but if you're getting adequate sun exposure, you don't need to really be supplementing vitamin D. But when you think about the seasonal affective disorder, right? And I've always said this, I'm like, I don't know how people live in Seattle or places that don't see the sun. Like, I would literally be depressed, right? I really think I would be a depressed person if I lived without sunlight. So for me, it's like, and that's kind of the mood regulation part that I'll talk about in a second. But vitamin D production also has this direct change on the human body, but from immunal function as well. So when you think about getting sick, and we learned this through COVID, it's like, oh, okay, like, well, I could have prevented a lot of this stuff just by having adequate sun exposure and keeping my vitamin D levels high. And the cool thing is, for majority of all humans, you don't need hours and hours and hours of sun exposure to have adequate vitamin D production. For most of us, it's 20, 30 minutes would be totally fine, right? Second one, the sunlight increases nitric oxide production, right? So UVA rays are going to be the one that trigger the nitric oxide production. And I remember, this is actually funny, when I was taking these notes last night, I used to think about the first supplement or second supplement I was taking. I would take all these nitric oxide boosters, right, for workouts. So I'd have like a pre-workout. These things were like horse pills, and you would take like 8 or 10 of them before a workout. And nitric oxide is the thing that we think about, like, that gives you the pump, right? So you get the expansion of the blood vessels and the endothelial cells and all those good things. But that is going to be something that is essential for cardiovascular health, right? So we want nitric oxide production. So I'm not saying go supplement once again, but this is also one of the beautiful things that sunlight gives us, right? So nitric oxide promotes vasodilation, which is going to help lower blood pressure. It's going to improve circulation, and it's going to reduce the risk of all cardiovascular disease, right? So next one's going to be improved mood and mental health, right? This is something I've talked about a couple times already, but serotonin, which is going to be linked to mood and being calm and being happy. Then we're going to think about dopamine production, and then we're going to think about melatonin regulation, right? And melatonin is a big antioxidant, which is also going to be something you'll hear me touch on in a second from the immunal side as well. But just sun itself, like I always like to remind people, like, just go outside and tell me how different you feel versus being inside. And I don't know if it's something that I've created like a confirmation bias on, but then again, the more research I do, like, there's things that are actually saying like, okay, this is actually something that is changing the body from a hormonal level. So getting the improved mood or the improved mental health, and this is why for me, it's like going outside and going and taking walks is going to be such an essential piece to health, right? Number 4, melanin is actually a natural antioxidant, right? So this is going to be important for us to like kind of fight this oxidative stress too, because when you think about melanin, it's basically like melanin is kind of the shield that your body's building with sun exposure, right? So this is going to help prevent DNA damage in skin cells. This is going to help prevent oxidative stress, like I just said, and this is going to help, most importantly, reduce the risk of getting sunburnt, because that is damaging the skin, right? So people with more melanin are obviously going to be protected against some of these skin cancers as well, too. So having a higher melanin production, and this is totally normal with seasons, because if you live somewhere in the Bay Area, California, we don't get a lot of like really, really hot days or days that you want to be out in the sun with skin contact in the winter. Some days are cold and you're wrapped up in pants and beanies and sweaters and things like that. So understanding that getting your production during the right seasons is going to be important too. But the more exposure we can get throughout the year, 365 days a year, is what the focus should be. Number 5, immunomodulation, which is basically going to be understanding that. So this is a little bit deeper and out of the scope for me, but like psoriasis, eczema, like multiple sclerosis, a lot of things that I was kind of looking up last night, overactive immune responses, and just inflammation. A lot of these things can be modulated from the sun, right? So this is where you get some of those immune modulation. But then the last one was talking about physical activity, and someone that's tan are kind of not causation, but more correlation. Meaning like a lot of like when I'm looking up like, okay, what are the benefits from a health perspective of having this? Also, a lot of things that kept popping up is like people that have a lot of sun exposure also tend to have more outdoor time, more time in nature, more physical activity, better sleep, better mental well-being. So you just see these kind of direct and indirect kind of benefits of having a tan or having more sun exposure. And I will always say, from an aesthetic perspective, there's always been this kind of saying in the fitness community is like, if you can't tone it, you tan it, right? Which is basically the understanding that like we look better tan too. So like, why would we not prioritize having more of a tan? And I think that's because a lot of us tend to fear it a little bit, right? So the next section I want to go through is like, okay, with vitamin D production being a big part of what most people think about with sunlight, why is it such a bad thing for us to have low vitamin D, right? So this is where I will say this entire section for me was a big learning curve yesterday. And I was even sharing this with my wife yesterday about just some of the things. I was like, oh, that's like interesting because I think on the low vitamin D production side, we think about sun being something that increases the risk of cancer and skin cancer, more importantly, obviously. But then when I started to go through it, you start to realize that like, whoa, there's actually the inverse kind of thought on we're reducing skin cancer, obviously, if we're doing all the things we just talked about properly. But I'll read off a couple things as far as evidence goes. Breast cancer was number one. A lot of meta-analysis were showing that basically a 30 to 50% lower risk of breast cancer when you had proper vitamin D levels, right? And this is in relationship to vitamin D, which is in basically indirectly a relationship to sunlight exposure. Colon cancer had a significantly lower risk, prostate, pancreatic, all these things. And so you think about vitamin D regulation of cell growth is going to be the thing that's actually going to help us protect ourselves from future and other cancers as well. So that was number one. Number two is a weaker immune system and a higher infection risk. Like I talked about, COVID-19 taught us that probably more than anything about this, the relationship between immunal function and vitamin D levels. So having low vitamin D levels increase the risk of that. And that comes from a lot of things that I will never understand, right? Vitamin D plays a role in activating the immune system. Without sufficient levels, T cells, macrophages do not function optimally. So number three, greater risk of depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. And that I think comes from everything we just talked about with serotonin levels, dopamine levels, melatonin production, everything like that. Number four, higher risk of autoimmune diseases. Number five, weaker bones, higher fracture risk. Number six, higher blood pressure, cardiovascular risk. Number seven, sleep disturbances and circadian disruptions. And those 7 things, I think, just should be enough motivation outside of just the typical reasons of why we think we'd want sun exposure for you to prioritize this as a health level, right? Now, the things that I wanted to kind of just polish off today's episode with is like, okay, you've kind of explained and convinced me a little bit more of like the importance of having sun exposure and the importance of prioritizing sunlight and the importance of prioritizing the full spectrum of lighting, right? So not just the middle of the day, but early morning, late at night, how it helps with sleep, how it helps with immune function, how it helps with mood regulation. But the question is now, how do I build up without using the toxic sunscreens? And this is where I want to make sure that there's context to my answer as well. I'm not saying that sunscreen is bad. A lot of people think that I think that because I don't use it a lot. But there is a lot of sunscreens that continually get recalled for the toxic chemicals and things that they have in it. So these things are cancer causing. Like you had this big lawsuit with Neutrogena last year, and one of many. A lot of companies are getting sued for these things. And like now these companies are starting to switch over to like zinc oxide or titanium dioxide and some of these more natural byproducts of like things that are going to be a little bit healthier. And those two, for example, like they basically put like a protective film over versus being absorbed into the bloodstream. So we want to be careful, right? Because I think like getting adequate sun is important, but building up gradual exposure would probably be number one. But using sunscreen is still something that we should be doing. We just want to be careful with kind of the things that we're using, right? So for me, like an easy one is like, and I was actually just talking to this, and this could probably be its own episode, just the benefits of coconut oil. I forget what the company is called, but I got it out in Maui or Hawaii last year. And it's literally just coconut with some fragrance. But coconut oil is actually like an SPF 4 or 5, if I remember correctly. That's obviously a natural thing to put on the skin. There's a lot of people on this kind of like animal-based diet are talking about tallow-based things. I personally have used a tallow-based sunscreen one time, and I hated the way it felt. It felt like I was like putting icing on my skin. I love Maui Bay. Well, a lot of people think it's like, obviously it is a browning lotion, but like coffee extract and caffeine are actually things that are going to help with reducing the effects of getting sunburn, right? Or they're reducing the effects of the sun itself. And this comes from like a topical being applied to the skin, but this also comes from actually drinking it as well. And when I'm thinking about like, okay, like from a dietary perspective, like vitamin D is this production thing that we actually want to make sure when you look at your diet in relationships to some of the food, if you have a diet that has a lot of polyphenols, right? So vegetables, fruits, coffee, wine, coffee kind of doubling down for caffeine and polyphenols. Those are going to be things that are going to protect your body internally, right? When you think about having enough good, healthy fats, right? So when you think about omega 6 and omega 3, there needs to be a balance. Ideally, we want to look at like a 5-to-1 ratio of omega 6 to omega 3s. The thing with the modern day diet with most processed foods is we're close to like a 50-to-1, which is pretty crazy. But these omega 6 can be more inflammatory, and actually something that I found kind of interesting, and I don't know if there's much research on this yet, that basically talking about how people, when they started to switch to a whole food diet or prioritizing more of those, that they were getting sunburnt less, right? I don't know if this is true or not. So this is just something that I found kind of fascinating. But I would agree that when you think about having an internal sunscreen, one of the supplements I talked about last week, astaxanthin, I can never pronounce that word. The carotenoid of basically fish and algae. Fish get this, and this is what gives them the pink colors when you think about salmon or shrimp, things like that. But they get that color from eating algae as far as their diet. But this is something that was always known as a supplement, as like an internal sunscreen, right? So you get these things, right? So it's not fair for us to say that diet doesn't have an impact on us and sun exposure and the protectiveness that it gives us. But you get this from caffeine, you get these from polyphenols, you get this from vitamin A, you get this from vitamin E, you get this from vitamin C, you get this from collagen. So there's a lot of things on the dietary side that we do get, but also just coming back to that fat part, we want to make sure that we're limiting our diet that's really, really processed and having a lot of omega 6, because the higher the omega 6 is, the more inflammatory those things can be, which in relationship to what we're talking about today can be something that's detrimental, right? So prioritizing more omega 3s, prioritizing more saturated fats, right? So more importantly, just like prioritizing more fats that are going to come from animal meats and animal proteins, right? Sunglasses was something that I kind of touched on a little bit. So like there's a lot of things that you can do to protect yourself, but the most important thing, as I would say, is like A, having a clean diet, B, having gradual sun exposure, C, prioritizing early morning and late night sunlight. These are all going to be things that are going to help you build up the production of melanin. It's going to allow you to build up the tan, and it's going to protect you, most importantly, right? So I don't want to talk too much, as I always do, but those are the big things that you guys need to understand, and why the sunlight is such a powerful thing. And it was interesting, a lot of the little things that I was going into just on the religious side and the spiritual side of sun and how we view it, and the masculine energy and the divine energy. And I was like, I don't know if I want to throw that in there today, but like you can go down the rabbit hole, but sunlight is not something you should be scared of, right? Make sure that you understand it's a practice and you dose it properly and you respect it. Make sure that your diet is in relationship that can protect you. But when you think about living a long time, looking really good, and prioritizing health and preventing cancers and being all the longevity part of what we're going to talk about so much, you need to have this as a part of the diet, right? I think one of the things that's kind of slowly changed for me is I think the more pale I see a health coach, the less I respect him a little bit. Like it needs to be something that's just as essential to your exercise as it is to your diet, as it is to your sleep, as it is to your stress, because it also plays an impact on all those things and how you feel and how you operate. So that's it. I want to leave you guys with that. That's episode 3, and I'll see you guys next week. Take care.